I don't expect Oregon to be as good in 2025, but they might mess around and make the Big Ten championship game again anyway.
You are Locked On Ducks, your daily podcast on the Oregon Ducks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, it is that time once again for Locked On Ducks. I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin. Thank you so much for making this your first listen or your first view every day, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, and your number one source to stay up to date with the Ducks. Lots to get to today. Future of the quarterback room. Oregon basketball won. Woohoo! Hang the banner. Not really, but that's all coming up on today's show. But start with this question that came in from Pinoy R310, which sounds, like close-ish maybe to a relative of R2D2, and that happens to work because I'm wearing a Star Wars shirt on today's show. So, what are your thoughts of Oregon running it back to the Big Ten championship game with this squad? Well, I don't expect the 2025 squad to be as successful let me rephrase that. I don't expect them to have the same ceiling as what they had in 2024. But record-wise, it could be a very similar sort of year because Oregon's schedule is incredibly favorable going into next year, even more so than it was in 2024, which is one of the reasons I predicted Oregon to go 12-0. Well, hey, you get Ohio State at home, Michigan on the road. Michigan's not going to be as good. Oregon's really tough to beat at Autzen Stadium. You got a veteran quarterback, and what do you know? They went 12-0. Well, going into next year, there's really just the one game where Oregon figures to be an underdog or close to it, and that's at Penn State. And the Nittany Lions are going to be a really good team next year. They were this past season. We saw that in the Big Ten championship game. Oregon had the big lead. Penn State clawed their way back into it. I did feel like Oregon was solidly the better team. The final score was a little bit closer than that game really indicated, but there were a couple of situational moments where Oregon couldn't, put the final nail in Penn State's coffin going into next season or going into the second half of that game. And so as a result, hey, Penn State had a chance and Oregon was able to do just enough. But the interesting thing is our friends at FanDuel do not see Penn State and Oregon the same way that I do at the moment. So the Big Ten favorite, predictably, Ohio State plus 170, Oregon second at plus 230, and Penn State third at plus 380. A bigger gap between Oregon and Penn State than Oregon and Ohio State. Just an interesting note. Because Penn State's schedule, I discussed this over on Locked On College Football today, is sneaky difficult. They have to go to Iowa, tough place to play, not always a great team, but usually a good team. Just one to keep your eye on. That and going to East Lansing to play Jonathan Smith in Michigan State, who I talked about last week on the show. That's a really good coach. That's a place that's got plenty of resources. If they could put together the right caliber of talent, they've got an incredibly high ceiling quarterback in Aiden Childs. But Oregon's berth in the Big Ten championship game might just come down to that Penn State game. It'll also depend on whether Oregon has a higher floor than maybe I feel like they deserve credit for right now here in the middle-ish part of February. So the two teams that are most likely, of course, to make the Big Ten championship game, the ones I mentioned, are Penn State and Ohio State. There's almost a complete circle of playing one another with those squads, but Oregon plays Penn State plays Ohio State does not play Oregon, though, which is a notable break for the Ducks, of course. So Penn State's big games next year are Oregon, September 27th. They have that game against the Ducks at home off a bye. Major scheduling advantage, and that's the only aspect of Oregon's schedule next year that isn't favorable. They have to go to Washington as well, but you're going to have some road games that are not going to be cakewalk games for a win. But certainly, the rest of Oregon's schedule, you look at it and go, even with all the turnover there, kind of seems like they're going to be favored and maybe by substantial amounts in a lot of those games. But getting back to Penn State for a moment and how that affects Oregon's hopes of getting to the Big Ten championship game. So they've got the Oregon game. They have to go at Iowa, at Ohio State, Indiana, and at Michigan State. Let's say they beat Oregon and have the head-to-head. but lose to Ohio State. That then puts Oregon in the predicament of Penn State's got to lose Penn State has to lose at least one other game, and Oregon can't have a second loss. You would need Penn State to then be at 10-2 and Oregon at 11-1. Now on paper, 11-1 sounds great. I think 10-2 is more likely for Oregon going into next year. I don't quite know where I'd predict that second loss to be as of now, but if they were to lose to Penn State and stumble somewhere else, then that would remove, I think, in all likelihood, running it back to Indianapolis to make the Big Ten championship game. Ohio State, conversely, has a handful of important games as well. They have to go at Washington on September 27th. It's a long road trip. I know Ohio State's going to be the better team, but that's a long road trip, and teams that have come west haven't had a whole lot of success, lest we think about Ohio State last year that, of course, lost to Oregon and Eugene before beating them senseless in the Rose Bowl on a neutral side. But Ohio State has to go at Illinois. That's a good team for Oregon to miss this year. They're going to be, I think, much improved. They were a good team last year. Oregon just played incredibly well that day, and the game was at Autzen Stadium. Ohio State has to go at Wisconsin. They host Penn State, and they have to go at Michigan. So again, I don't think Oregon's going 12-0 again next season. That is a remarkably difficult thing to pull off in college football. It's not something that we've really seen a lot of over the last couple of years. I believe Georgia is the last team to have consecutive 12-0 years. Michigan might have had it in there as well, but that's asking a lot to go 12-0 again. So if you figure there's at least one loss in there, you're going to need, and it's probably going to be to Penn State, at least that's the most likely game. You need Penn State to lose to one of those other teams, and they don't tend to lose those games. Now, maybe Ohio State stumbles against Michigan for a fifth straight year under Ryan Day. And as for Michigan's Big Ten title hopes, Oregon doesn't have a head-to-head there. They don't play Penn State. They, of course, play Ohio State as they do every year. I think Michigan in the Big Ten title race is 1 year away from catapulting themselves back into the top. They've got a quarterback question. They brought in a transfer from Fresno State. They flipped Bryce Underwood, the number one overall player and quarterback, obviously, in the country, from LSU. But I don't know that he's starting right away. So they have a little bit of, a handoff from one regime to the next at quarterback. Well, it wasn't much of a regime this past year for Michigan at quarterback. It was kind of a mess. But I expect them to be a Big Ten championship contender or one of the top favorites going into 2026 more than 2025. So those are Oregon's biggest threats to make the Big Ten championship game. Now, you could throw Indiana in there if you would like. Indiana has to go to Penn State and to Oregon. Not wild about their prospects of winning either of those games. They could be slightly better, but I think they've downgraded at quarterback from Curtis Rourke to Fernando Mendoza. So to go back to your question, Pinoy R310. I think the chances that Oregon gets there are pretty solid. If they beat Penn State, I'm trying to think of how, if they're good enough to go on the road and beat Penn State, who'd be at home off a bye, how they wouldn't make the Big Ten championship game or how they wouldn't be good enough to get there. But I think Oregon's chances are incredibly solid, but they're probably going to need some help somewhere because they won't have that head-to-head advantage over Ohio State. And, if it came to a tie, like if they lost to Penn State, but Penn State lost to Ohio State, and it came down to a head-to-head tiebreaker with Ohio State to get to the Big Ten championship game, like let's say they both went 10-2. Let's say Oregon loses at home to Indiana, just as a random example. Ohio State loses to Michigan and somebody else somehow, Washington or whatever, because craziness just starts to ensue, and there's a tiebreaker. It would go to the highest-seeded common opponent, which would be Penn State. Oregon would have the loss. Ohio State would have the win. So I think it gets difficult when you look at the other schedules, but if they go on the road, beat Penn State, yeah, they're probably going right back to Indianapolis, and I would gladly see you all there once again. So let me know your thoughts below in the comments or hit me up on Twitter as well. What does the future quarterback look like? Someone posed a really interesting question that got me thinking along those lines, and you don't want to miss any of that. and you don't want to miss how many things Wayfair can do for you. After the holiday hustle, there's nothing like giving your home a little TLC. I always find that decluttering and refreshing my space helps get me back into a routine. And let me tell you guys, I am big on routine. Huge routine guy. Whether you're tidying up, clearing out, or just want to give your space a new look to start the year, Wayfair has everything you need all within your budget. They've got free and hassle-free delivery even for the larger furniture items, which they've got a huge selection of. They've got a wide array of styles. It's going to fit your budget as well. Wayfair is the place to go if you want to get a little furniture shakeup wherever you live. There's something for every style and every home, and Wayfair makes it easy to tackle your New Year's home goals. Give your home the refresh it needs with Wayfair. Head to wayfair.com right now. That's WAYFAIR.com. Wayfair, every style, every home. Do we count Dante Moore as a transfer starting at quarterback? You know, like he was committed to the Ducks, went to UCLA, transferred back, sat for a year. At the very least, it's not a plug-and-play transfer who you brought in. It's someone who was on the roster the previous season, sitting and waiting his turn. So it's kind of that weird gray area. But beyond 2025 for Oregon at the quarterback room, what do you think that looks like? Drop your predictions below or hit me up on Twitter. I bet you all have a wide variety of predictions on that front because Dante Moore is going into his third season of college football. And this is a guy who, even when he was coming out of high school, when I talked to him in Las Vegas, he was very open about the fact that, yeah, one of my goals is I want to get to the NFL and be a starting quarterback. He believes he can do that. Would you be able to get where you want to go in the NFL draft after 1 year of starting? Maybe. We've seen guys do it before. Mitch Trubisky started, 15 games at North Carolina? I know it didn't work out, but he got drafted, had the opportunity there. So Dante Moore started a handful of games at UCLA and, of course, started no games for Oregon last year because the offensive line kept Dylan Gabriel upright, and he's, just kind of a well-built, he's not a big guy, but he's a sturdy enough guy, and so too is Dante Moore, and fingers crossed he stays healthy the entire year. I'll get to Austin Novosad more in just a moment, but what if Dante Moore, what if I am wrong about Dante Moore and he deserves not just to be a preseason top 10 Heisman favorite, but to be top 2 or 3, and he gets himself in the running and he throws for over 4,000 yards and 38 touchdowns and 5 interceptions and runs a little bit as well, but he's just looking pinpoint accurate, second coming of Drew Brees. What if he does all of that? Maybe he declares for the NFL draft. Suddenly Oregon is back to, okay, we need a starting quarterback for 2026. So if that happens, well, that would be great for Oregon's 2025 prospects and outperforming my preseason expectations. But for Oregon, kind of makes things a little bit complicated at the quarterback spot. On the other side of the coin, he could be Oregon's starting quarterback for the next 3 seasons. Because he utilized the red shirt this past season. I'm pretty sure he fell inside those guidelines, and so he would start this year. He burned a red shirt opportunity, of course, at UCLA because he was the starter at one point in time. But he could be a 3-year starting quarterback. He could be a 2-year starting quarterback, which is why you always want to have options. It's why Oregon's going after both guys in Ryder Lyons and Jared Curtis in the class of 2026. You just want to have choices. It's why they were willing to have Once Upon a Time, even though I had an inclination that JKS wasn't going to stick with the Ducks long term because it's never where he wanted to end up. Was Oregon, of course, willing to accept it? Why were they going after him, even though they already had Achilles Smith Jr.? Because you always want to have options. So Oregon's quarterback room is unique under Dan Lanning going into this year in that it's not a guy who is a proven starter in college football. There is a question mark there, and it's one of several I have for this team going into the fall. But, gosh, would that be the biggest question? I don't know. Maybe I'll explore that on another episode of the show. But if Dante Moore winds up having this great season, maybe Oregon has to convince him to come back with a hefty NIL package. But then what would that mean for Austin Novosad? And in the short term, what do you do with Austin Novosad if you're Oregon? You'd love to develop and have him available to be a starting caliber quarterback going into 2026 if Dante Moore winds up being a one and done. but I imagine he's not going to sit around forever. So Novosad is someone who we saw in the spring game last year was the biggest standout from that event. By far. It was the biggest takeaway I had from the spring game. Holy smokes. Dante Moore looks exactly like I expect him to. But man, that Novosad kid can sling it, and he is accurate, and he looks like he's got a big arm. Made one bad decision, but that was really it. Everything else, he was phenomenally good. So if you're able to have both these guys who came out in the same recruiting class, 2023, and both have utilized a red shirt and are now going into their third season of college football, there are plenty of similarities there. But would he be willing to wait for that opportunity? If they go through, look, the outside standpoint for Oregon's quarterback situation going into 2025 is going to be Dante Moore, right? There's a picture that shows up on Instagram of him talking to the team, and Trayshawn Holden and Tez Johnson and all these guys are gassing him up on their way out the door off to the NFL draft. So that's the perception, but is that always reflective of what's going on in the room? Is there a 0% chance that Novosad beats him out? I don't think it's 0. I think it's probably 5 or less. But it might not be 0. He could have the opportunity. But if you're Austin Novosad and you want to start one day, this is obviously among the most quarterback-friendly offenses that you could possibly start it. Back-to-back Heisman Trophy finalists at quarterback. Nobody else has that. Nobody in the country has produced back-to-back Heisman Trophy finalists at the quarterback position. But Will Stein has done it. So I just wonder what his thought process is. Is he comfortable being the backup this year? And that Dante Moore will be one and done and it'll be his turn? And then he'll get to be the guy ahead of Achilles Smith Jr. and we'll keep the ball rolling? Or does he know, maybe I'm not going to be a starter? I don't know. I'm fascinated to see how that plays out. If you told me right now Austin Novosad hits the spring transfer portal window, I wouldn't be totally shocked. Just because the path to playing time, remember, Luke Moga's in that room as well, and Achilles Smith Jr. is in there now as well. I wouldn't be shocked if he seeks greener pastures, but maybe he waits to see how the season plays out. Because Dante Moore's also a guy that got benched at UCLA because he kept throwing interceptions. Well, if that happens again, and Oregon has to make a change, Novosad would be the most likely guy going into his third season. So maybe that's an opportunity he's willing to wait for. Maybe it isn't. But that could absolutely be coming into play if Dante Moore has not rectified the issues that he had as a true freshman at UCLA. I like his chances. I certainly like his chances to be able to do that. But let me know below. How many years do you think Dante Moore starts as Oregon's quarterback? 1, 2, or 3? All are options. This all stemmed from a question I got from a Locked On Ducks insider, where you get priority mailbag access and a bunch of other perks as well. Link in the description below. You can get a free 14-day trial. Question. Hey, Spencer, fun question for you. You mentioned on the pod you could see Dan Lanning winning a championship with Oregon in the next 5 years, a national championship, because, of course, he just won a Big Ten championship. Say that prediction comes to fruition. Fingers crossed. Who do you see being the quarterback that wins the Natty for us? That's an incredibly difficult question to answer. I think Oregon's team in 2026 is going to be awesome. And I could see that being Dante Moore. I think it is more likely Achilles Smith Jr. is the quarterback that wins Oregon a national championship, which would be beautifully poetic, than Austin Novosad. Just because of the timelines and the path to playing time. Right now, as a 2025 kid, I'd say it's most likely Achilles starting by 2027. And if it's his first year, then I'd say it's really hard to start in your first year and be at that sort of level, but less difficult when you sat for a couple of years, right? Mariota sat for a year, and in 2012, that team was good enough to win it all. They just had to stumble at home against Stanford. So that I think would be more likely, and I think as a passer, Smith and Novosad are way ahead of where Luke Moga is. That's somewhat of a wild card in this whole quarterback discussion, but overall, I'd say Dante Moore or Achilles Smith Jr. in the next 5 years. You're talking 2025, 26, 27, 28, or 29. In one of those 5 seasons, the way that Oregon's recruited the last couple cycles and when those players should be rounding into the best versions of themselves, 26 is going to be a great chance. I think 27 could be as well. I think they will both be better opportunities than what Oregon will have in 25, but I think they'll still be in that position this fall because the schedule is really favorable and they still have plenty of talent across the board. So drop your predictions below. How many years does Dante Moore start? And who's the quarterback that leads Oregon to its first national championship? Welcome to February, folks. This is the way we roll. And we roll with basketball as well. They won. Woo! They won. Oregon, what? Dana, it's a 5-game losing skid. It's done. I've still got questions, man. I cannot overstate the importance of Oregon having beaten Northwestern on Tuesday night at Matthew Knight Arena. Was not a huge crowd, was not a huge game, needed to win it, got it done. So the 5-game losing skid is over for now. Hopefully that continues. There's still plenty of bad stuff. Let's get to the bad stuff, and then we'll end with the good stuff and the positive outlook. Rutgers is up next on Sunday at home. That's not good or bad. That's just what comes next for Dana Altman's squad here, who are 17-8, 6-8 in conference play. All right, here's the bad stuff. They played a great defensive first half. Northwestern is not very good. I don't know how they've won 4 conference games. I really don't. The Big Ten is the second best conference in the country by all the available metrics behind the SEC. They have a win over Maryland. They beat Indiana, USC, and Illinois. I don't know how. I really do not know how. I believe they were missing a player in this game, but they did have the leading scorer in the Big Ten, Nick Martinelli, who got it going in the second half, but Oregon actually did a good job. He was just 7 of 18 from the floor. But Oregon at home in a must-win game plays a great first half, just like they did on Saturday in East Lansing, and then in the second half, gave up 50 points. Northwestern scored 25 points in the first half. They are not a particularly skilled team. A better team would have beaten Oregon tonight. 50 points in the second half to Northwest. Just, oh, man. Not okay. That is, again, the Ducks failing to play good defense in the second half. And look, I understand when people get frustrated. Hey, why can't Oregon get off to stronger starts? Well, guess what? They did. Everything in the first half of this game and of the game on Saturday against Michigan State, which they should have won. They had a 14-point lead and blew it. And they allowed a 50-piece in the second half, I'm pretty sure. Everything about the first half is what you're looking for from this team. Come out, get good shots, be knocking them down, play hard on defense, and make things happen in a good way. Yeah, they allowed 50 points in the second half for the second straight game. Pretty incredible. But defensively, the effort just wanes. The attention to detail. They give up threes. They let teams just score at will inside. There was a stretch at about the 12-minute mark of the second half. Northwestern was making like 73% of their shots. I think that went past the midway point of the second half. This has to change. Has to change. And again, getting the win, important, good. Let's feel good about that they avoided catastrophe here. But the underlying sign there that they are allowing 50 points in a half for the second straight game, no bueno. Not good, not sustainable. So that's the problem. And in the first half, the defense was great, and it was helping the offense. Getting them easy shots, putting them out in transition. All of those things were really, really good. But then in the second half, they're not there. And you've got veteran guys and a veteran coach, and I don't know what's missing there. But that is the biggest glaring problem with Oregon right now. So something I talked about last week. That's really all the bad stuff that is here. Oregon shot the 3 ball respectively, 8 for 21. They started to get a little 3-point happy, and then they got away from it. 8 of 21, I'll take that game in and game out for this team. They put up 81 points. Solid. 28 free throw attempts. They made 25 of them. That was huge in this game. 47% from the field overall. Lots of good things. So amidst the losing streak last week and the just massive letdowns that they couldn't pull it out at Michigan, who's the top team in the Big Ten right now, or hold on to a 14-point halftime lead against Michigan State and go minus 26 in the second half, is they scored 80 points on the road in both those games. They scored 74 and 76 points in those games. They allowed 80 or more, but they hit the 80-point threshold here. And if you continue that scoring pace, averaging 75 points per game on the road against high-end quad one teams, and then at home you're hitting 80-plus points, that is fantastic offensively. And there have been offensive woes for this team. But as we have talked about with Dana Altman many times over the years, they start to put it together more as the season goes on. This offense is coming together. And it starts with Jackson Shelstad being aggressive. Only 2 guys actually hit threes for Oregon tonight. No surprise that Jackson Shelstad was one of them. He's been on a heater in conference play. He had a career-high 26 points. He was 8 of 11 shooting, 4 of 6 from 3, made all 6 of his free throw attempts. This is the Jackson Shelstad that I always knew was going to arrive. When he was struggling early in the year, he was a sub 30% three-point shooter, and he was well under 40% from the field. That's not who he was a year ago, and this guy is once again showing you why he's a preseason All-Big Ten selection. You talk about living up to the recruiting hype, he's that kind of guy. But he needs to enforce his will. Oregon got off to a strong start offensively this game because Shelstad was aggressive, not just shooting threes when they're open in catch-and-shoot situations, but looking to create his own shot, getting downhill, go to the basket, work the float game, use his quickness to drive by guys and get easy buckets. He was doing everything, and it was great to see. He also had 4 assists in this game. I talked about that recently as well. 26 points, 4 assists. When Jackson Shelstad does that, Oregon's going to be a tough team to stop offensively. Now, the other good thing about this game is that they played 40 minutes of good offensive basketball, and they were not content to just jack up threes. That is the biggest weakness that this team can fall into, is they hit a couple threes and they just keep putting them up. Just keep putting them up, keep putting them up. I thought they did a much better job trying to find an inside scoring presence. The bigs for Oregon were not great in this game scoring inside. Angel, I think teams have just kind of figured him out down low. You be really physical, and he's going to struggle. Supreme Cook was getting mauled, and so was Nate Biddle, frankly, at times, and they just weren't getting the foul calls down low. But they weren't scoring consistently in there, but Oregon was at least getting more threes off drive and kick opportunities. And if you go 8 of 21 or somewhere in that range from 3, game in and game out, and then shoot over 20 free throws, I think that's a formula for success for this Oregon basketball team offensively. They played 40 minutes of good offense, and they played 20 minutes of good defense. You're 3/4 of the way there. So up next is Rutgers on Sunday. That's a must-win game as well for me because you're at home, and Rutgers, like Northwestern, not that good. They have a couple dynamic freshmen that they mentioned on the broadcast. You got to win that game at home and just avoid the bad losses, and Oregon will find their way into the tournament. They still have some quad one opportunities. They go at Wisconsin. They have to go at Iowa. They've got difficult games upcoming. But if they just win the games that they should, not even all of them, if they just win most of the games they should, they'll get to 20 wins. And with their resume, if they just get to 20 wins, they'll squarely be in the NCAA tournament field, and then anything could happen. Truly, anything could happen. But they have to find it on defense. Appreciate everyone listening. I will see you next time. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and go Ducks.